Prime Minister has confirmed almost all remaining COVID restrictions in England will be lifted on Monday as planned. Social distancing and limits on events will end and nightclubs will be able to reopen.
However, with the number of COVID cases continuing to rise, Labour has slammed the government's decision as reckless. The Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy, joins us now. Hello, Lisa. Nice to see you again.
Good morning.
Now, look, I think there's general agreement across the board that the government, and in particular Boris Johnson's tone yesterday at 5 o'clock was ambivalent at best. It was ambivalent. He sounded very thrown, actually. But I must be honest with you, I'm as vague about what Labour would do if they were in power as I am about what the government's saying. I mean, what would you do if you were in charge?
Well, look, everyone's had enough of lockdown and we're desperate to get the country moving again. But this is like starting the car without putting your seatbelt on. There are protections that should and could remain in place. The government's own scientific advisors say that they work. Mandatory mask wearing, for example, on public transport and in crowded places like busy shops. Better ventilation for buildings, giving a clear instruction to work from home for those who can do it. Instead, what the Prime Minister's done in the last 24 hours is created a really confusing mess where he's hailed Freedom Day, he said that we're opening up, he said the restrictions are going, and then he's asked people to be really cautious. He said that masks, for example, are something that will be expected. Well, how do you enforce something like that on a busy public transport system? Just seems to me that he's shifting the burden of this to the public, to frontline workers and to businesses, when what we actually need is clarity. Let's get things moving, but let's do it with caution and let's learn the lessons from other places, like the Netherlands, where they were very quick to open up last month. And yesterday, the Prime Minister had to apologise, said that it had caused a huge rise in infections and they were going to have to go back into restrictions. Again, we don't want to be there in London. If this is going to be the last in Britain, if this is going to be the last lockdown, and it must be, then we've got to proceed with caution.
For all the criticism, he's doing ever so well in the polls. We've got the latest polls that came in this morning for 4 of them here. iPoll Tracker, Conservatives 42, Labour 34, Statista, Conservatives 46, your lot 30, YouGov, Conservatives 46, you're down to 28 on that one. All the criticism doesn't seem to be having any effect on him. I mean, he's Mr. Teflon, isn't he?
Well, look, the criticism that we're making this week is about doing the right thing for the country. We want the country to succeed just like everybody else. And I suspect that what you're seeing in the polls here is very much what you're seeing in the polls across the world. At the moment, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. People desperately want their governments to succeed. And in the most recent elections across the United Kingdom, we saw that in Wales, we saw that in Scotland, and we saw that in Westminster as well. People want their governments to succeed. They want the country to come through this. We want that as well, but we want the Prime Minister to start taking responsibility for his actions, providing clarity for the public. We cannot be in a situation where we go back into lockdown in just a few months' time.
If there was a situation then, after the summer, if infections go back on the... I mean, they're rising now, but if they go back on the rise and hospitalisations go up and, God forbid, deaths go up, despite the vaccination programme, you've just said this must be the last lockdown. Would you then resist attempts to put us back under restrictions come the autumn as a Labour Party?
No, we'll protect the NHS and we'll support health leaders to do that. But what many health leaders are saying at the moment is that's why we've got to proceed with caution. We want this to be the last lockdown. We can't afford to keep doing what we've been doing over the last year, where we've yo-yoed in and out of restrictions because the Prime Minister wants a good headline. So this is the moment where we've got to take that seriously. We've got to learn from other places. We've got to follow the science and we've got to proceed with caution because, of course, it isn't just about COVID infections and people being admitted to hospital with COVID and long COVID. It's also about the huge backlog of operations that are currently due on the NHS. That there was a backlog going into this pandemic. It's even bigger now. And many hospitals, including my own, are very, very worried about the prospect of being able to fulfil the obligations that they've got to a lot of people across the country in terms of their other health needs as well. So, that's why we're saying to the Prime Minister, stop with the rhetoric, give us a clear plan, give us clear advice, and we can come through this together.
Well, speaking of clear plans and clear advice, I think every decent human being watching this programme and walking this land of ours knows what they think about this disgusting racism which has reared its head over the last 24 hours. We all know what we think about it. We can take that as read. What do you think we should do?
I think a number of things. Firstly, we have to lead by example. And when, yesterday Gary Neville, I think, spoke for a lot of people when he said that senior politicians, including the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary, had stoked this by giving permission to people to boo the England players for taking a stance against racism. I think the last 24 hours have shown us why they felt so strongly that they had to take a stance against racism, and we should support, applaud and encourage them for doing so. But I also think the social media companies could do far, far more. And there's been a demand to hand over the details of those who are perpetrating this appalling abuse. People should not be able to hide behind anonymous online accounts.
Is that something that you as a party then would call for an end to, the anonymity of individuals on social media? I mean, that comes at a price, of course, doesn't it? Because in certain countries where you might face penalties for posting something online, but posting something online might be important to you politically, if you lose your anonymity, you're going to get sought out by the state. There might be very sensitive issues around your own health that you perhaps want to share anonymously. So are we prepared to pay that price, losing that freedom of speech, in order to crack down on the horrific abuse faced by these footballers?
Well, these are exactly the questions that parliamentarians need to debate out and legislate for, to make sure that people can't hide behind anonymous profiles in order to commit hate crimes. In the real world, many of the things that are done online would constitute a crime, and they should be treated as such on the online world as well. But also to make sure that we protect people, that we allow people to engage in debate. I used to work with children who were being abused in the voluntary sector, and one of the great things that's happened in recent years is that many of those children can seek help through online platforms without necessarily having to give their identity. That's why we've been pushing the government to introduce a proper legislative framework in the online harms bill that's currently going before Parliament. Instead, what they've been doing is siding with the big tech companies, watering down that legislation. After what we've seen in the last 24 hours, I don't think there's a right-thinking person in this country who thinks that can continue, and we're going to push them really hard to make sure that we get this right, that we hold social media companies to account, so that we hold people to account for the actions that they take. They have an enormous impact on all of us. Those three.
Nandy, you make such a good point there about the fact that people who might have been victims of abuse need to have anonymity in order to be able to access the help that they need online. So are you saying that the Labour Party stops short then of saying that accounts should always be public and verified identities? Because that, again, that is the price. You would lose that voice if you made that happen.
Well, there's a difference between accounts being made public and verified identities, and these are the issues that we've been debating out in Parliament recently. You can verify your identity with the social media company, and if a crime is committed, or perhaps harm is suspected to be being done to you, that can warrant an intervention. And that's different from requiring people to put their name, their address, their photograph, their shoe size on the internet. And so there are ways in which this can be done, and we've been looking at lessons from around the world at ways in which other countries have tried to tackle this. We're at a very early stage, I think, in terms of dealing with online harms on the internet. But what has become increasingly apparent is that this situation is unsustainable. I think my colleague Diane Abbott a few years ago called it the Wild West out there on the internet. And for far too many people, that is their experience, not just for those three brilliant young footballers who've had such appalling abuse recently, but for lots of people in this country who've been watching that and feel this is not my country, we've got to do something about it.
Sorry to interrupt you, because we're tight for time as ever. It's become a matter of urgency now, hasn't it? Up with this, we simply cannot put any longer. I mean, our own colleague Andy Peters was saying earlier, it's just ludicrous that we have this dissonance between life on the pavement and life in virtual reality, so that somebody who throws a banana, he was saying, at Andy Peters, could be prosecuted. But they can do it online and not take any consequences. We've got to close that dissonance. We've got to close that gap urgently, haven't we? Enough's enough.
I think Andy is completely right about that, but I also think that we've got to create a culture in which this sort of behaviour is not acceptable. And one of the most heartening things of the last 24 hours is the number of people, the outpouring from decent people across this country who say these people don't speak for us and they don't represent our country. And that takes me back to the point that I was making earlier that Gary Neville made so powerfully yesterday, which is the tone has to be set by senior politicians. And I'd like to see a change in tone from this government. We've got a Prime Minister with a track record of stoking racial tension and racial division, even in the run-up to this Euro tournament, and that's got to change.
Would you like to see our Home Secretary, would you like to see Priti Patel revising what she said a few weeks ago about taking the knee?
Apologise for what she said. I don't think we should be booing the England team. We should be applauding them, and when they take a stance against racism, we should be standing with them just as they've stood with one another and with people across this country.
Wow, OK. Lisa, Nandy, thanks very much indeed. Good to talk to you this morning.